Welcome to the 60th A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts. In this six-part lecture series, entitled The 12 Caesars, Images of Power from Ancient Rome to Salvador Dali, Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University examines the continuing engagement throughout history with images of Roman emperors and its impact on Western visual art and culture. In this third lecture, entitled Warts and All, Emperors Come Down to Earth, originally delivered at the National Gallery of Art on April 10, 2011, the esteemed classicist and Professor Mary Beard shows how portraits of emperors took part in the transmission of power, legitimizing in marble an authorized genealogy of descent.
Thank you, everybody. I am so pleased that we are all here. I don't... And to you. I don't think there's ever been a time I'd be more relieved actually to start giving a lecture, and know that I'd actually made it. I've been spending the week looking out of my office window at the Capitol, thinking, come on, come on. Selfishly. Anyway, to business. I might be wrong, but my guess would be that if I were to ask you who this is represented in the portrait on the screen, that not many of you would get the answer right. It's not a Roman emperor, but it is a head of state, and it's actually a living head of state. I'll give you just a minute to reflect and then show you the answer. Because it is, in fact, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, seen here in her more familiar role. And it's a portrait by Matthias Kawage, an artist from Papua New Guinea, now in the royal collection. It's a gift from Kawage himself, and it was warmly accepted by Her Majesty, who in return gave Kawage a medal, rather like the ones that she's got on here. Now, I show it to you at this point, partly because it makes a nice parallel with an image of Augustus that I put on the screen very briefly in the first lecture, one of several named portraits of the Roman emperor in what was then the Roman province of Egypt, a portrait casting him as a traditional Egyptian pharaoh. Now, whether the initiative for portraits of this type came from the Egyptians themselves, anxious, like Kawage obviously was, to represent the ruler according to their own conventions of ruler portraits, or whether it came from Augustus, anxious to exploit the visual idiom of old Egypt, and as it were to insert himself in the world of the Egyptians as the new pharaoh, we don't really know. But either way, it's a nice reminder of the cultural diversity of the Roman Empire, which images of the emperor himself don't often give us a chance to glimpse. Another rather gratifying one, just in brackets from me, is one to which I'll come back in the last lecture, but it's this from Iran, which shows a decidedly humbled Roman emperor here doing obeisance in front of the Sasanian king. And we don't often see the Roman emperor in the model of the defeated enemy. So this is quite a nice reminder that he looked different depending on where in the Roman world you looked at him from. And that, in a sense, is what comes out of Kawage's portrait. But more important for me this afternoon, that Papua New Guinean artist's portrait raises in a particularly vivid, not to say lurid form, issues of recognizability that we've been talking about in the last two lectures. Some we've touched on, more than touched on in some detail, The question that I raised, for example, in the first lecture about how we recognised Julius Caesar out of all the portraits in the Roman world that might possibly be of him, or rather, as I stressed, I think, what counts as recognising a portrait of Julius Caesar? How on earth do you know you're right? What would it mean to have identified Caesar? But there are other aspects of this, these general issues of identity and recognisability with rather different implications that I'm going to be exploring today. And in fact, I'm going to be suggesting that in a funny way, confusion of images, the indistinguishability of Roman portraits, was in part the point of them. It was the point of the dynastic portraits of Augustus and his immediate successors that you couldn't tell them apart. But as you'll have noticed, I called this lecture Warts and All, which was a reference to a famous remark credited to Oliver Cromwell, there he is, the 17th century rather dour English soldier and politician who managed briefly to overthrow the monarchy and was actually instrumental in having King Charles I executed. The story goes that when he was asked by the portrait artist, Peter Lely, who did this, how he would like his portrait painted, Cromwell replied, quote, "I desire you would use all your skill to paint my picture truly like me, and not flatter me at all, but remark all the roughness, pimples, warts, and everything, otherwise I'll never pay you a farthing for it." Now, those lines are very likely apocryphal, and the shorter and snappier and much more often quoted version, in which he just says, "paint it, warts and all," certainly is apocryphal. But apocryphal or not, they represent a distinctive cultural attitude to portraiture, which is going to be in the back of my mind through some of the things we're going to be looking at today. I'm also once more going to be moving forward in time, because in the second half of this lecture, we're going to be getting more familiar with the second half of Suetonius's 12 Caesars. I'm going to be looking particularly at the period of civil war that leads into the next dynasty. We'll take a quick look at a rather warty Vespasian, but I'm going to be lingering particularly on Vitellius, a short-lived emperor who was, until I think a century ago actually, one of the better-known characters out of this dozen. He was raised to the throne, like all of these actually, by an army faction, and he was written up by Suetonius in a brief life. It was brief partly because he was only on the throne for 8 months. And he was described by Suetonius as a monster of cruelty and gluttony, but in the end, the victim of a very nasty end, which I'm afraid we'll be looking at. Well into the 19th century, even the 20th, he was often deplored, and at the same time, I suspect, secretly admired for his extravagant dining habits. Writers in the 19th century in literary magazines and newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic would often call someone a Vitellius if they wanted to signal a particularly lavish lifestyle. And his violent overthrow became the stuff of moralizing painting. For Vitellius was an emperor brought down to earth in a dramatic and horrible way, captured here by the winner of the French Prix de Rome, the foremost prize for young artists in France, in the competition of 1847, a particularly violent year in Europe with a particularly violent picture winning the competition. Now, I'm going to be exploring this fascination with Vitellius and the ancient imagery on which that fascination is based. But I shall also be looking at how and why what we will see as the distinctive physiognomy of Vitellius, why it enjoys a life outside images of classical antiquity itself. What are we going to make, for example, of finding a look-alike Vitellius, and we'll see him in a minute, but there he is, a look-alike Vitellius on parade as a servant in this great painting by Paolo Veronese. But first, to images of dynasty and to issues of recognizability and individuality, or otherwise, of imperial portraits among the dynastic successors of Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. In the story of these lectures so far, I was extremely sceptical in lecture number 1 about the possibility of ever isolating bona fide ancient images of Julius Caesar. Now, someone asked me last week if I would put up my 3 main specimens again in a lineup, so here you are to remind you. As you'll remember, I insisted that each one of these had come in turn over the last 150 years to stand for Caesar to the modern world, but that there was no conclusive evidence that any of them were ever really Caesar. But then last week, I showed a series of imperial busts and statues labelled Augustus and Tiberius and so forth, without emphasising quite the same degree of scepticism. So what's the difference? Well, partly I've got to confess I didn't want to irritate everybody in the room by constantly saying, this is a statue believed by many to represent Tiberius, rather than, this is Tiberius, because it gets a terrible mouthful. And as I said earlier, in some ways, every imperial title for every imperial statue, it is best to assume that they're titles in inverted commas. Nevertheless, even though I think that it's better to start out from the point of view of broad and universal scepticism about who these people are, the fact is that from Augustus on, we are in a slightly different position, and we're on slightly firmer ground, or perhaps better, we're on ground that is dodgy in a different way. That's the position. Now, sure, some of the basic issues are still the same. There is absolutely no magic bullet for identifying these portraits. Apart from our look-alike pharaohs with their hieroglyph cartouche, which conveniently names Augustus, they don't come with names attached. Throughout this dynasty, it's once again, if you're trying to identify people, it's pretty much a matter of matching up sculpture and coin portraits that are named sculpture, and occasionally throwing a bit of Suetonius in if he helps. And a lot of puzzles still remain. Take this nice pair of figures, one male, one female, from a building next to the Forum in Pompeii. They have been identified in any number of different ways over the last 200 years. Some people think that the lady is Augustus's sister Octavia with her son, or maybe it's Augustus's wife Livia with her natural son Drusus, or maybe the woman was intended as something to be Nero's mother, Agrippina, or maybe, as one common view now holds, they're not members of the imperial house at all, but a couple of local burghers in a kind of slightly aspirational mode of the small town of Pompeii. You know, you can feel good if you look like an emperor. We just don't know. Nevertheless, things are a little bit clearer with these portraits than they were with Caesar, partly because of the sheer number of images in the new imperial style, and partly because of some very close matches that we can draw up between sculptures. Just to go back to the images of Augustus we had on the screen last week, I'm certainly not saying that any of these looked like Augustus in the kind of Cromwell's warts and all sense, and indeed none of them actually reflect what Suetonius mentions or invents as Augustus's distinguishing facial features. He says he had eyebrows that met in the middle, what we would call a Roman nose, it went out at the top and came in at the bottom, and gappy, small and blotchy teeth. Right? Whether Suetonius knew that or not, there's certainly no sign of it in the images. Nonetheless, you would have to be a skeptic whose perversity goes even beyond mine, not to say that this was an official image of Augustus, whether it looked like him or not. Apart from anything else, the breastplate here illustrates one of his great diplomatic coups in recovering some lost military standards. And this little Cupid here almost certainly refers to his entirely fictional but much vaunted descent from the goddess Venus. It would likewise, I think, be perverse not to see a match, as we had on the screen last time, between this marble sculpture and this bronze sculpture here, with the layout of the hair, as we looked at, being almost identical below. That said, for many, probably the majority of these portraits of the First Imperial Dynasty, problems of identity do still remain, though not quite in the same open-ended way as with Caesar. What I mean is that for Augustus and his family, we can often, not always as we saw at Pompeii, but often be reasonably confident that a portrait is intended to represent some member of that Julio-Claudian family. What we don't know is which member it was intended to represent. Let me give you just two examples. First, a relatively simple one. This marble head in the British Museum has been labelled over the years as Augustus himself, the mad Caligula, Augustus's imperial successor but one, Augustus's grandson Gaius, who is the son of his daughter Julia, who was adopted as Augustus's heir but died on military service aged 24, or as Gaius's brother Lucius, also seen as the heir to Augustus, and also the victim, in the eyes of some, of a suspiciously early death. So, 4 contenders from the imperial family for just one statue. A rather more complicated version of the problem is on the screen now, and it's a puzzling sculpture from the Vatican which shows clear signs of having been altered in the ancient world itself. The giveaway is this bit of the hair. You see, the hairline once ended there, and he's had some more hair put in. You see it very clear. And something odd has happened here. Now, this has had even more different identifications than the one I've just shown you. It's been said to be Augustus. It's been said to be Caligula again. It's been said to be Nero. It's been said to be a statue of Augustus, but then reworked into a statue of Nero. And vice versa, it's said to have been a statue of Nero, reworked into a statue of Augustus. Or a statue of the young Gaius, Augustus's grandson, also reworked into a statue of Nero. We don't know. And it's not only in marble that those issues come up. Here's a cameo from the British Museum. Is it the young Gaius? Is it the young Lucius? Or is it another slightly later imperial prince who also came to a nasty early end, Augustus's great-nephew Germanicus? We don't know. And the obvious moral here, which I hardly need point out, is that if in a museum you ever see a label identifying a sculpture as a Julio-Claudian prince, never believe it. Right? They might be a Julio-Claudian prince, but you better anything, we haven't got the foggiest clue whether it's Gaius or Lucius, or Germanicus, or Augustus, or Caligula, or Nero, for that matter. Now, it has, not surprisingly, been a major art historical project for centuries, at least back to the 16th century, to try to untangle this and to match up those sculptures that have what we might call the Julio-Claudian look with the right prince, the right heir, or the right emperor. And in recent years, a truly prodigious amount of work has gone into drawing fine distinctions between various images, and particularly looking at, with increasing detail, at the locks of their hair. on the assumption, as we briefly looked at last time, on the assumption that there would originally have been some official prototype for all these hundreds of images, and that the details of the locks of the hair is likely to be the best giveaway, the clearest diagnostic of which sculpture matches up with which lost prototype. Now, anybody in the room who is interested in the historiography of art history should be reflecting at this point that this is a version of the Morellian method, but with a curious twist, because this is directed to using those particular details to identify not the artist, but the subject of the sculpture. Now, keenly observant as much of this work is, and I don't mean to imply that I'm just dishing it, it also tends to overlook the much more obvious point that this is dynastic art, and that these portraits are trading on similarity between one prince and another, much more than they're trading on difference. Rather than devoting all our expertise to finding the differences between them, perhaps we need to think instead, or as well, about how to think about what the similarity between these portraits is doing. I mean, I have to say that I find this one of the kind of most perverse areas of ancient art history at the moment. You know, you use all your academic expertise to try and show how all these portraits are subtly different, when the most important thing about them is they all look the same. And that's... Now, in order to think if they look the same, so why do they look the same? I think here you have to think back to the succession problems of the imperial family. There were, if you remember, no fixed formal rules for the hierarchy of inheritance. Problem number one. Problem number two, at the head of the dynasty after Caesar, Augustus and Livia had no children together, though they'd each had children by different partners. Problem number three, the chosen heirs, like Gaius and Lucius, kept dying off inconveniently early. Now, given those problems, visual images had a very important part to play. They did more than what we saw them doing last week. That is to say, they did more than forcing the emperor into the field of vision of his subjects, and they did more than stand in for the imperial presence in that kind of literal way we were looking at. Because statues are also parading and legitimizing imperial succession, and part of their job was to make the chosen heir look the part, and looking the part meant looking like, not necessarily absolutely identical to, but looking very like the ruling emperor, and looking like Augustus, to whom ultimately the right to rule in this dynasty was traced back. Now, these issues of succession can also sometimes help us understand the Roman practice, which is actually much more common than we would imagine, of recarving heads on statues or inserting new heads into old statue bodies. Julius Caesar was said to have had his own head inserted into the body of a statue of Alexander the Great, and Augustus followed suit by painting out a face on a famous painting of Alexander and replacing it with his own features. Now, that, as I said in the first lecture, that was not for reasons of economy. You know, Augustus didn't say, I'm afraid I can't afford a painting by Apelles of myself. Anyway, he's dead, so I will put my own features into that painting. It was done in order to parade an ideological dissent from the great Greek conquering hero. The more or less subtle adjustments and recarvings that we can detect on quite a lot of other Roman marble portrait heads, just enough, presumably, to kind of morph the appearance of one emperor into another. may, I guess, on occasion have been a matter of money saving. They may also sometimes have been a convenient way of obliterating the identity of an emperor who'd fallen from favour and replacing it with a subtly different physiognomy and a different name. But as with those Alexander examples, the recarving that you see here may also have been a way of physically representing the process of the transmission of power. It seems to me that in some ways, the visible changes, literally and physically wrought into the marble, sort of instantiates dynastic succession. It instantiates the transmission of power from Gaius to whoever succeeds him or whatever. Now, I want to diagram that for you on screen by showing you a family tree of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Now, up to this point, I have protected you from the family tree of the Julio-Claudian dynasty by focusing entirely on Suetonius's nice list, very neat and trim list of emperors, the first 6 of whom you see here. Now what you need to do is to take a deep breath and see what a relatively simplified diagram of the dynasty looks like if you include the women, the different branches, the dead ends, the dead heirs, and so on. And that's what it looks like. Now, let me stress 2 things right away. First, there is no one I am going to claim in the history of the world who has ever held this in their head, right? You know? I used to think that the only way I'd ever get to grips with Roman history was being able to say, oh yes, he was the great-great-nephew of, eventually realised that was not the point. No one had ever known this, not even Robert Graves when he was writing out Claudius. He still had to have the diagram on his, he must have worked with a diagram. No. And of course, that is partly the point. This family tree is too complicated to remember. Right? This is dynastic confusion at its absolute best, or worst, however you choose to see it, at least at its most dynastic. That's one thing to remember. You don't need to learn it. Secondly, for people who are nearer the back, it doesn't actually matter whether you can see it properly or not. Because the idea is not to pin down who actually married who or which great-nephew died too young, but to get the big picture of complexity. Because that picture, I think, drives home how important the idea of forging a visual line of legitimate descent might be in this dynasty. In other words, what these largely look-alike Julio-Claudian sculptures are doing is help to create an authorized genealogy of descent amongst this mess. Now, just by way of contextualizing the ones you already looked at, I've now put them here next to the family tree and outlined in red who they might be. Here's query Gaius, query Augustus, query whoever, with his possible identifications, and there's the more complicated one with you have to get lines and arrows going forward on this one. Now, I had considered giving you this to read in line as you waited, but I thought that, actually, I was too scared. I thought if you saw that was what the lecture was going to be about, you might decide that the Canaletto show was a preferable alternative. So we had them at the back. Some people have already got them. I'd intended them only for the masochists in the audience to pick up as they left. But if you haven't got one and you want a Julio-Claudian family tree, as long as you promise you won't try and learn it, there will be a pile of them more at the back to take away at the end. The question then that follows from this idea of sculpture as a legitimating device amongst the madness of imperial succession, the question that follows is what is the visual consequence of this when we get to the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty? Now, by 68 AD, the practical dynastic options had all been exhausted. Nero had come to the throne in 54 as a teenager with all the predictable consequences, disastrous as they were, of having a teenager on the throne. There, I promise you, Charles Lawton as Nero, and I'm sure this is an absolute dead ringer for Nero. Suetonius has many tales to tell, lurid as they are, of his crimes, how he killed his mother, how he kicked his pregnant wife to death by mistake, how he... That's what happens if you're an emperor. Even your mistakes have kind of global consequences. How he took over the whole of the centre of Rome with his palace, and famously remarked, having taken up the whole centre of the city, now at last I can live like a proper human being. Right? So, disastrous consequences of teenager on the throne, but what is more, he had no natural heirs, and the most of the obvious candidates for succession had been eliminated by him in attempt to secure his position against rivals. So he ends up being a monster with no likely succession plans. And the end comes when the army turns against him, and throughout the year 69, which is often now known as the year of the four emperors, different legions fought it out to get their own candidate on the throne at the end of this hereditary dynasty. The winner and the founder of the next dynasty was Vespasian, whose images, and I say this with all the usual caveats about precise identification, whose images looked like that. Now, there is an immediate temptation, I think, to treat this as a brutally realistic portrait of a kind of warts and all type. And it's true that Vespasian did, as far as we can tell, emphasise his down-to-earth, old-fashioned Roman common sense. It was he, for example, who, according to Suetonius, put a tax on urine, which was a vital ingredient in the Roman laundry industry. And he cannily, if also apocryphally, I think, remarked, "Money doesn't smell." Right. There is, of course, no more reason to suppose that Vespasian actually looked like that than that Augustus looked like the portraits that we know of as him. What we see in that portrait, however, is a new dynasty, a new deal, an attempt to claim a return, in a way, to traditional Roman virtues after the fancy and extravagant excesses of Nero and the dynasty that he stood for. And that's what this portrait style, which has certain echoes back into the portraits of the Republic, and you'll see that this is more like the portraits of Caesar than the portraits of Augustus are. That is what this portrait style is shouting. It is shouting, I am not a Julio Claudian successor. This new deal on the throne. So that's my most warty example, I think, that we're going to have today. Because the rest of the time, I want to concentrate on that year 69, between the two dynasties, focusing, as I said, on just one of the emperors, which is the Emperor Vitellius, whom you can see here in a 17th century version. The basic outline of Vitellius's reign is clear and brutal. He was declared emperor by his legions in Germany early in the year 69. These troops marched into Italy. They defeated in battle the forces of the previous short-lived emperor, the Emperor Otho, and they had Vitellius officially recognised as emperor in Rome in April. But in fact, the challenge from Vespasian and his army had already been launched in the east, and Vitellius was murdered by Vespasian's forces when they finally reached Rome in December. That's the narrative. April to December, he's on the throne. Suetonius stresses three things about him. First, his vicious cruelty, or what you might call, I suppose more politely, his civil war morality. Notoriously, when he visited the site of the battle at which his soldiers, as it happened without him, had defeated their fellow Romans under his rival Otho, he is supposed to have remarked, "The stench of a dead enemy is wonderful, The stench of a dead fellow citizen, even better. And it's that slogan which our 17th century illustrator has headed his image of Vespasian with. Second, Suetonius headlines the gluttony and the loose living of his few months in power. His usual routine apparently was 4 feasts a day. And in that old cliché of Roman dining, he's supposed to have made himself sick in between meals in order to cram more in. On one particular occasion, Suetonius is both shocked, horrified, and delighted, I think, to relate that he served a vast platter of, quotes, the livers of pike, the brains of pheasants and peacocks, the tongues of flamingos, and the milt of lampreys, brought by his captains and his triremes from the whole empire, from Parthia to Spain, and so on. So, cruelty, luxurious living, and finally, and in some ways horribly more memorable, was his death, which is really the longest extended section of the life of Suetonius. Suetonius describes how, when Vespasian's forces came into Rome, they found Vitellius hiding. He tries to pretend he's not the emperor, but they weren't having that one. He was tied up. His arms were tied behind his back. A noose was put around his neck. He was dragged to the forum to be mocked and pelted with dung until he was tortured and dragged off with a hook and thrown into the river Tiber. Now, how accurate, let's hope it isn't, how accurate any of this is a pretty moot point, but there's no alternative version of Vitellius' life, partly because it's not actually in anyone's interest, usually, to write positive accounts of people who are the losing faction in a civil war. So we would expect exactly what we have, which is a pretty uniform hostile tradition, at least in literature. As for images of Vitellius, an 8-month reign of continual conflict, or, if you believe Suetonius, continual eating, is not likely to produce much high-quality marble sculpture. But there are numerous coin portraits, of which that is a typical one. I think the point is you have to remember is that however rough it got, however much the Roman world was collapsing about them, Roman emperors always went on minting coins. And they always went on minting coins because they needed them to pay their army. So civil war is a particularly good moment to find coins because everybody is minting them to pay their rival troops. And sometime in the early 16th century, this head was unearthed in Rome, apparently in excavations and building work, being sponsored by Cardinal Grimani, which seemed to be a good match for the coins. Let's go back. Good enough. And was not actually incompatible with Suetonius' brief description of him. Though Suetonius is mostly concerned, he drank so much that his cheeks were always red. And this sculpture, which was apparently dug up in Rome in the early 16th century, was then given to the city of Venice by Cardinal Grimani in 1523, where it still is in the Archaeological Museum, commonly known as the Grimani Vitellius. Now, that short summary of the images, a coin plus a possible portrait, would not probably lead you to expect quite the artistic impact that Vitellius, and in particular this Vitellius, had in Europe between the 16th and the early 20th century. For a start, this Grimani Vitellius was repeatedly copied and imitated in 3-dimensional form, and there's no problems about recognizing the copies. Here's a famous version of it from the Louvre. Here are 2 little ones from Vienna. Here is Meddardo Rosso's version in the V&A. And here's Brancusi's version. And just to bring it home to DC, here's the one I found on sale in Georgetown a few weeks ago. Intriguingly, actually, to move beyond fine art for a moment, one copy in the early 19th century found its way into the hands of one David George Goyder, who was an enthusiastic proponent of the then fashionable science of phrenology, which claimed to be able to deduce character from the precise form of the skull. And at least on the lecturing circuit, Goyder went round with a plaster cast of the Grimani Vitellius, which he used as a case study for his audiences in the 1840s. Vitellius he would show the people that came exactly the shape of head you would expect for a cruel man. And it was a nice illustration, a nice proof of the claims of phrenology. But he was also, of course, extensively copied onto paper, and he was adapted in a whole range of painted portraits. Here is a nice pen and ink sketch from the National Gallery's own collection. Interestingly, this sketch was once owned by Peter Lely, who did the portrait of Cromwell that we looked at earlier. But honestly, it actually crops up all over the place from the 16th century on. Here you've got Tintoretto and Lebrun, Jim Dines, some Romans, some Greeks, some Romans, also doing Vitellius. Now, of course, this raises, as we saw last week, the big question about how far Vitellius and his ghastly imperial history and horrible morals remain significant in these images. Now, the cruelty of the man was central for our phrenologist Goyder, and in fact, that is precisely what the head was intended to reveal and prove. The demonstration only worked if you took Vitellius for the monster that Suetonius had painted him. But what of the huge range of sketches, drawings, copies, busts, and miniatures that go far beyond that? Well, I have no doubt that there are many factors at play. And in part, I'm certain that the striking physiognomy on its own was an element in the artistic appeal. For Medardo Rosso, in fact, you get the feeling that it was actually the sheer collapse of physical facial form that made this sculpture an appealing modern image. But we find here too a number of strong visual clues that the image had emphatically not become designified culturally or politically. It hadn't become just a convenient bit of wallpaper or a convenient bit of iconography to be lifted. It was still Vitellian in a historical sense. Take, for example, this rather disturbing 17th century still life, where Vitellius is one of those images presiding on the shelf over this parade of the emptiness of literary culture. There he is, and there we have a load of useless, battered books. You can't see this, but this is a copy of Suetonius, actually. So Vitellius is presiding over the wreckage of Suetonius's biography. Now, I think that's showing a sense that there's a point to this image of Vitellius, which is more than just he looks interesting. Perhaps even more awkward questions are raised by this image of a young boy intently drawing the Grimani bust, or one of its many versions. I think here the juxtaposition of the young, soft and innocent face of the child with the soft, voluptuary, far from innocent face of the subject is part of the point. As is the question that as soon as you've looked at this for a few minutes, you're bound to ask yourself of what is this young innocent doing, concentrating so hard on this face of depravity? And what does that say then about artistic practice that somehow normalizes that encounter? And what's it saying about us in looking at that going on? So I think there's an issue here that Vitellius is still seen to be a problematic, however striking image, and that sometimes you get a recognition of that actually in visual form. But questions like that, questions about the awkwardness of illustrating Vitellius, were raised a couple of hundred years later when, as I mentioned at the start, the theme of the death of Vitellius was set as the painting subject for young French artists competing for the Prix de Rome in 1847. Now, I showed you earlier the first prize winner, Jules Eugène Lenepveu. Here is the runner-up. And here, another notable entry. I tell you, there's about 15 of them, and they all look like this. What is absolutely clear is that these diligent young French artists had all taken the features of the Grimani Vitellius, and they had all read their Suetonius very carefully. They all, for example, and Lenepveu most dramatically, have his hands bound behind his back, and as Suetonius also insists, they've picked up his remarks about the visibility of Vitellius throughout this process. Suetonius says rather horribly that his killers, as you see here, pressed a weapon to his throat in order that his head was exposed, his face was exposed to the crowd who'd come to mock him. Now, in a way, I think it's hard not to detect a rather disconcerting enthusiasm in the way the young competitors have approached this grisly theme. And certainly it was disconcerting for many of the reviewers of the prize competition of 1847, who had very little to say in favour of the subject the judges had chosen. I'm quoting, "It offers nothing which lends itself to fine sentiments or fine form," complained one, who went on to ask, "What kind of satisfaction can one derive from the representation, however well it is done, of a monster like Vitellius dragged to death?" And many others echoed those thoughts in the 1840s. Noble themes from Rome, they said, might be okay, but it was quite another for the judges to go, this is a quote, "digging around amidst the blood and the mud of Rome and to come up with Vitellius." It was, they generally agreed, very bad for young talents and minds. So I think that ambivalence that we're seeing in the engraving that I showed you of the young boy copying Vitellius is coming out explicitly in these mid-19th century comments on the prize competition. In some way it was odd, though, because in fact the subject of the death of Vitellius had a pretty long history. It wasn't newly invented in 1847. Here is a mid-18th century sketch of the same theme. There is a rather more kind of sort of fat and pathetic Vitellius being led off to slaughter. And it was to have a long, if slightly curious future, including a movie made in 1910 of the death of Vitellius, which only 5 minutes survive, and I've not seen it, but apparently one wouldn't want to. But also going beyond that, what you see here, and this is very curious actually, what you see here is a popular mass market print produced in the early 20th century, so popular that you can pick it up very easily on eBay even now. And it's based on a painting that was first exhibited in the Paris Salon of 1886. And although it's maybe not clear on the screen, it is actually very emphatically labelled, as I've said, the death of Vitellius. Now, when you look at it, I think at first sight, your instinct will be that this scene has been dramatically censored since the 1840s. He hasn't got his hands pinned behind his back. There's kind of no aggressive nudity. There's no contortions. Instead, Vitellius here, in a rather calmly Socratic way, appears to be enjoying his last drink, as maybe was appropriate. In fact, something stranger is, it's not just been toned down, sanitized, something rather stranger has happened, which is uncannily reminiscent of that whole retitling episode of those tapestry scenes that I looked at last week. Because as the Salon catalogue for the original painting on which this was based makes absolutely clear, this wasn't originally a Death of Vitellius at all. It was painted with the title of The Acclamation of Vitellius as Emperor by his troops. And his troops are some rather kind of dramatically Germanic soldiers here. In the process of replication, that much rarer scene of Vitellius acclaimed by his troops has been reinterpreted as the common scene of the death of Vitellius. I think it's interesting because those of you here last time, might not like now to reflect that it isn't only 17th century weavers who decide to dramatically reinterpret the scenes from these imperial histories. Whoever's flogging this image thinks it's a death of Vitellius, or at least that a death of Vitellius would make a better sales pitch. But actually, the Grimani Vitellius makes some other and rather more surprising appearances in the art of the 19th century and earlier. And these appearances encourage us to engage with the question of what the face of Vitellius is doing when it crops up in this range of paintings. What difference does it make to have the Emperor Vitellius in your picture? Not all the scenes I'm going to look at are classical, but I'm going to start with a couple of classical ones. By a curious coincidence, in the very same year as the young French artists were working away on their prize pieces of Vitellius's death, another Vitellius was on show in Paris at the Salon of 1847. It wasn't another death scene, and he might not have been immediately obvious as you wandered round the show, but observant Salon critics certainly did spot him. But he has a cameo role in this vast and famous canvas by Thomas Couture, Romans in the Decadence of the Empire. It is vast, it's about 25 feet by 15. It is a complex and rich reflection on Roman imperial vice, as well as being, as almost every critic hammered home in the time, a scarcely disguised allegory for the corruption of contemporary French society. It is the greatest sermon ever painted, as somebody described it. But for the moment, I want simply to pinpoint for you the Vitellius figure here, not hard to spot, just about to fall into a drunken sleep, despite the fact of this rather icy maiden on his lap. Now, big painting of the decadence of the Roman Empire. Round the side, actually, these statues have whatever they really were. They are statues commonly identified at the time as some of the less immoral emperors of the Roman Empire. You've got Augustus and Germanicus there. Is this just, then, a bit of artistic borrowing? Or does a distinctive Vitellius make a difference to how we read the scene? I think the steer it gives our reading is pretty clear. For Vitellius is not merely a libertine, and so not merely a figure you'd expect to find in this kind of gathering, but as we have seen, he suffered terrible punishment for being a libertine. Here, it seems to me, in this painting, he is operating as a glimpse of the future. In this painting of imperial decadence, he is a guarantee of what is going to happen next, because we know he is going to be violently and horribly punished, as is this whole scene of Roman imperial immorality. Something similar might be at stake here too. This is one of Jerome's famous gladiatorial scenes, now usually entitled, "Hail Caesar, those about to die salute thee," from the gladiatorial slogan. In the 19th century, it was often called Gladiators Before Vitellius. That's because the tiny figure of the emperor in his books is none other than the Grimani Vitellius. Now, actually, as Jerome well knew, the Colosseum, which is what this building clearly is, was not built by the reign of Vitellius. It was the work of his successor, Vespasian. So why did Jerome flout the chronology? Maybe because he's just putting a pastiche together in which incongruity doesn't matter, or perhaps he's wanting to offer a kind of hint at how we read the moral dynamics of the scene we're witnessing. This is not just any emperor watching the gladiators, it is Vitellius. But the appearances of Vitellius get even more intriguing in paintings that take us outside the classical world in the strictest sense. Here on the screen again is one of Veronese's most famous and controversial paintings. It was done in Venice for the refectory of a Venetian religious order, and what has prompted a good deal of discussion is the fact that it was almost certainly originally painted as a Last Supper, but was then strategically renamed by Veronese himself after the Inquisition had objected to several features in it that they deemed unsuitable. Rather than change the painting, Veronese changed the name, and he called it after another biblical banquet, the Feast at the House of Levi. The figure I'm interested in is this one, the large servant in the foreground, who is often picked out in analyses of this painting because, as you can see, he's actually looking directly across at Jesus. And it's as if he were transfixed, and this is often written about as if this is partly a scene of his conversion. But it is also, as you will have spotted, the face of the Grimani Vitellius, which must then have been well known in Venice. So why is he here? Well, there's surely an interesting and edgy engagement between the painting and the historical resonance of Vitellius himself. For a start, we must be dealing, I think, with a blatant bit of triumphalism over the pagan ancient world. What Veronese is doing is parading the most luxurious and extravagant glutton amongst the Roman emperors as a servant at a Christian banquet. Now, that's also a piquant point that you find here in Jacopo Bassano, likewise a Venetian painting of the Supper at Emmaus, where this servant character here is also pretty much a dead ringer for the Grimani Vitellius. The paraded reversals of roles that we're dealing with here, Roman gourmand turned into a servant at Christian banquet, is a pointed one, and it's one intensified, I think, in the Veronese, if we take the line that somehow the conversion of that servant is being enacted in front of us in the very foreground of the painting. But I'm tempted to think that there's yet another level to this, and one that relates to the wider attempts we see throughout the history of Christianity to incorporate Roman emperors into the story of Christianity's history, like the story of Augustus and the Sibyl we saw last time. Because the family of Vitellius are implicated in the trial and crucifixion of Jesus, in a rather less fanciful way than Augustus and the Sibyl might have suggested. Because, as several ancient writers stressed, Vitellius' father, also called Vitellius, was the very Roman official who eventually dismissed Pontius Pilate from his position in Jerusalem not long after Jesus' crucifixion. That may perhaps give an added resonance to the appearance of Vitellius in Veronese's Last Supper. But it seems fairly clear to me that it is relevant to the appearance of the Grimani Vitellius in this painting by Bassano again of the road to Calvary, where the figure of Pontius Pilate in the background with a baton riding on his white horse has once again the face of the Grimani Vitellius. Maybe Vitellius was always a good choice to represent the man who condemned Jesus. But it's hard not to see the presence of Vitellius here as also amounting to a kind of retrospective, prospective claim of victory over Pilate. Pilate is here faced and effaced by a Vitellius. There is, of course, a sting in the tail of this story, as followers of the series may well have guessed. The origin of these distinctive images of Vitellius was this one piece of sculpture reported to have been discovered in the 16th century in Rome. Apart from the overall similarity to the coins, is there any reason to suppose that this statue was an ancient statue of Vitellius? The answer is there is almost none. On the admittedly perilous evidence of style and technique, scholarly opinion is now divided between the idea that this is an unknown Roman of the mid-2nd century AD, or that it is a forgery stroke pastiche of the 16th century, which was never dug up in Grimani's estate at all. And as such, it is a wonderful example of the intriguing dilemmas we find ourselves in. It's about the clearest case we've come across of the contradictions and paradoxes of these images, the complex interrelationship between forgery, identification, impact, and authenticity. This is a sculpture which both is Vitellius and has given the face of the emperor to the modern world, and at the same time, it never was Vitellius at all. But I'm going to close with a slightly different reflection. In the horrible death of Vitellius, we glimpse something of the fragility of imperial power, and that's a theme that emerges time and again in Suetonius' lives. My favourite example is from the life of Domitian, who Suetonius says was so terrified about who might be coming up behind him in the palace that he had his apartment walls lined with mirrors. Now, that idea of the fear of the emperor, the fear experienced by the emperor, prompts me to flow another answer to the question of who or what these images of emperors were for. They're usually talked about, as I have, as if they're directed outwards to the Roman public, and in part they were. But I have a sneaking suspicion that there was an important audience for these portraits within the palace too. In fact, some of them come from a palatial or at least imperial context. This famous portrait was found on a villa owned by Augustus's wife. And this pair are just two of a whole group of 2nd century portraits also found on an imperial villa. And besides, the most extravagant over-the-top images of imperial power are found on private court art, such as cameos, not the public art at all. This makes me think that a key viewer of these images was always meant to be the emperor himself. And in some ways, of course it was meant to be. Although it may be hard for those of us who are outside the circles of power to understand, I think one of the most difficult things about being a king or an emperor or a prime minister is to remember that you're a king, an emperor, and a prime minister. It's the problem of getting out of bed in the morning and not forgetting that you're the President of the United States of America. I think that's the problem. We always, 20 years ago, used to be told that Princess Diana got up in the morning and looked for the photographs of herself in the newspaper. We always used to think that was terrible vanity. I now come to think that probably what she was doing, it might have been vanity, but probably what she was doing was reminding herself that she was Princess Diana by looking at photographs of herself as Princess Diana. And so too with the Roman emperor. It seems to me that in the perilous world of imperial power, one of the jobs these statues are doing is not just convincing the Roman people who the Roman emperor is, they're actually convincing the Roman emperor that he was emperor. Thank you, and next week it's going to be women, right?